Welcome back to Prophecy Reformation now in this segment, because history is so much a part of prophecy, as all God-given prophecy is history in advance. We're continuing our trek with James A. Wiley through his The History of Protestantism. And today, having finished previously Volume 1, we are going to begin in Volume 2 with Book 8, Protestantism in Switzerland, from 1516 to its establishment at Zurich, 1525. Chapter 1, Switzerland, the Country and the People. The Reformation dawns first in England. Wycliffe, Luther, his No. What it implied: uprising of conscience. Who shall rule, power or conscience? Contemporaneous appearance of the Reformers. Switzerland, variety and grandeur of its scenery. Its history, bravery and patriotism of its people. A new liberty approaches. Will the Swiss welcome it? Yes. An asylum for the Reformation. Decline in Germany. Revival in Switzerland. In following the progress of the recovered gospel over Christendom in the morning of the 16th century, our steps now lead us to Switzerland. In England first broke the dawn of that blessed day, foremost in that race of mighty men and saviors by who instrumentally it pleased God to deliver Christendom from the thraldom into which the centuries had seen it fall to ignorance and superstition, stands Wycliffe. His appearance was the pledge that after him would come others, endowed with equal, and it might be with greater gifts, to carry forward the same mission of emancipation. The success which followed his preaching gave assurance that that divine influence which had wrought so mighty in olden time, and chased the night of paganism from so many realms, overturning its altars, and laying in the dust the powerful thrones that upheld it, would yet again be unloosed, and would display its underlying vitality and unimpaired strength in dispelling the second night which had gathered over the world, and overturning the new altars which had been erected upon the ruins of the pagan ones. But a considerable interval divided Wycliffe from his great successors. The days seemed to tarry. The hopes of those who looked for redemption were tried by a second delay. That arm which had cut the bars of the pagan house of bondage seemed shortened, so that it could not unlock the gates of the yet more doleful prisons of the papacy. Even in England and Bohemia, to which the light was restricted, so far from continuing to brighten and send forth its rays to illuminate the skies of other countries, it seemed to be again fading away into night. No second Wycliffe had risen up. The grandeur, the power, and the corruption of Rome had reached a loftier height than ever, when suddenly a greater than Wycliffe stepped on the stage, not greater in himself, for Wycliffe sent his glance deeper down, and cast it wider round on the field of truth than perhaps even Luther. It seemed in Wycliffe as if one of the theological giants of the early days of the Christian Church had suddenly appeared among the puny divines of the 14th century, occupied with their little projects of the Reformation of the Church in its head and members, and astonished them by throwing down amongst them his plan of reformation, according to the Word of God. But Luther was greater than Wycliffe in that, borne up on his shield, he seemed not only of loftier stature than other men, but loftier than even the proto-reformer. Wycliffe and the Lollards had left behind them a world so far made ready for the reformers of the 16th century, and the efforts of Luther and his fellow laborers therefore acted with sudden and prodigious effect. Now broke forth the day. In the course of little more than 3 years, the half of Christendom had welcomed the gospel, and was beginning to be bathed in its splendor. We have already traced the progress of the Protestant light in Germany from the year 1517 to its culmination in 1521, from the strokes of the monk's hammer on the door of the castle church at Wittenberg, in presence of the crowd of pilgrims assembled on All Souls' Eve, to his "No" thundered forth in the Diet of Worms, before the throne of the Emperor Charles V. That "No" sounded the knell of an ancient slavery. It proclaimed unmistakably that the spiritual had at last made good its footing in presence of the material, that conscience would no longer bow down before empire, and that a power whose rights had long been proscribed had at last burst its bonds, and would wrestle with principalities and thrones for the scepter of the world. The opposing powers well knew that all this terrible significance lay couched in Luther's one short sentence, "I cannot retract." It was the voice of a new age, saying, "I cannot repass the boundary across which I have come. I am the heir of the future. The nations are my heritage. I must fulfill my appointed task of leading them to liberty. And woe to those who shall oppose me in the execution of my mission. Ye emperors, ye kings, ye princes, and ye judges of the earth, be wise. If you shall unite with me, your recompense will be thrones more stable, and realms more flourishing. But if not, my work must be done nevertheless. But alas, for the opposers, nor throne, nor realm, nor name shall be left of them." One thing has struck all who have studied, with minds at once intelligent and reverent, the era of which we speak, and that is the contemporaneous appearance of so many men of great character and sublimest intellect at this epoch. No other age can show such a galaxy of illustrious names. The nearest approach to it in history is perhaps the well-known famous half-century in Greece. Before the appearance of Christ, the Greek intellect burst out all at once in dazzling splendor, and by its achievements in all departments of human effort shed a glory over the age and country. Most students of history have seen in this wondrous blossoming of the Greek genius a preparation of the world, by the quickening of its mind and the widening of its horizon, for the advent of Christianity. We find this phenomenon repeated, but on a larger scale, in Christendom at the opening of the 16th century. One of the first to mark this was Rouquat, the eloquent historian of the Swiss Reformation. It came to pass, he says, that God raised up at this time in almost all the countries of Europe, Italy not excepted, a number of learned, pious, and enlightened men, animated with a great zeal for the glory of God and the good of the Church. These illustrious men arose all at once, as if by one accord, against the prevailing errors, without, however, having concerted together, and by their constancy and their firmness, accompanied by the blessings from on high, they happily succeeded in different places in rescuing the torch of the gospel from under the bushel that had hidden its light, and by means of it effected the reformation of the Church. And as God gave, at least in part, this grace to different nations, such as the French, English, and Germans, he granted the same to the Swiss nation, happy if they had all profited by it. The country on the threshold of which we now stand, and the eventful story of whose reformation we are to trace, is in many respects a remarkable one. Nature has selected it as the chosen field for the display of her wonders. Here beauty and terror, softness and ruggedness, the most exquisite loveliness and stern, savage, appalling sublimity he unfolded up together, and blend into one panorama of stupendous and dazzling magnificence. Here is the little flower gemming in the meadows, and yonder on the mountain side is the tall, dark, silent fir tree. Here is the crystal rivulet, gladdening the vale through which it flows, and yonder is the majestic lake, spread out amid the hushed mountains, reflecting from its mirror-like bosom the rock that nods over its strand, and the white peak which from afar looks down upon it out of mid-heaven. Here is the rifted gorge across which savage rocks fling their black shadows, making it almost night at noonday. Here, too, the glacier, like a great white ocean, hangs its billows on the mountain's brow, and high above all, the crowning glory of this scene of physical splendors, is some giant of the Alps, bearing on his head the snows of 1,000 winters, and waiting for the morning sun to enkindle them with its light, and fill the firmament with their splendor. The politics of Switzerland are nearly as romantic as its landscape. They exhibit the same blending of the homely and the heroic. Its people, simple, frugal, temperate, and hardy, have yet the faculty of kindling into enthusiasm, and some of the most chivalric feats that illustrate the annals of modern war have been enacted on the soil of this land. Their mountains, which expose them to the fury of the tempest, to the violence of the torrent, and the dangers of the avalanche, have taught them self-denial, and schooled them into daring. Nor have their souls remained untempered by the grandeurs amidst which they daily move. As witness, on proper occasion, their devotions at the altar, and their heroism on the battlefield. Passionately fond of their country, they have ever shown themselves ready, at the call of patriotism, to rush into the battlefield, and contend against the most tremendous odds. From tending their herds and flocks on those breezy pasture lands that skirt the eternal snows, the first summons has brought them down into the plain to do battle for the freedom handed down to them from their fathers. Peaceful shepherds have been suddenly transformed into dauntless warriors, and the mail-clad phalanxes of the invader have gone down before the impetuosity of their onset. His spearmen have reeled beneath the battle axes and arrows of the mountaineers, and both Austria and France have often had cause to repent having incautiously roused the Swiss lion from his slumbers. But now a new age had come, in which deeper feelings were to stir the souls of the Swiss, and kindle them into a holier enthusiasm. A higher liberty than that for which their fathers had shed their blood on the battlefield of the past was approaching their land. What reception will they give it? Will the men who never declined the summons to arms sit still when the trumpet calls them to this nobler warfare? Will the yoke of the conscience gall them less than that which they felt to be so grievous, though it pressed only on the body? No, the Swiss will nobly respond to the call now to be addressed to them. They were to see by the light of that early dawn that Austria had not been their greatest oppressor, that Rome had succeeded in imposing upon them a yoke more grievous by far than any the House of Habsburg had put upon their fathers. Had they fought and bled to rend the lighter yoke, and were they meekly to bear the heavier? Its iron was entering the soul. No, they had been the bond-slaves of a foreign priest too long. This hour should be the last of their vassalage, and in no country did Protestantism find warriors more energetic or combatants more successful than the champions that Switzerland set forth. Not only were the gates of this grand territory to be thrown open to the Reformation, but here in years to come Protestantism was to find its center and headquarters, when kings should be pressing it hard with their swords, and chasing it from the more open countries of Europe. It would retreat within this mountain-guarded land, and erecting its seat at the foot of its mighty bulwarks, it would continue from this asylum to speak to Christendom. The day would come when the light would wax dim in Germany, but the Reformation would retrim its lamp in Switzerland, and cause it to burn with a new brightness, and shed all around a purer splendor than ever was that of morning on its Alps. When the mighty voice that was now marshalling the Protestant host in Germany, and leading it on to victory, should cease to be heard, When Luther should descend to his grave, leaving no one behind him able to grasp his scepter or wield his sword, when furious tempests should be warring around Protestantism in France, the heavy clouds darkening the morning which had there opened so brightly, when Spain, after a noble effort to break her fetters and escape into the light, should be beaten down by the Inquisitor and the despot, and compelled to return to her old prison, there would stand up in Switzerland a great chief, whose pitching his pavilion amid the mountains, and surveying from this center every part of the field, would set in order the battle a second time, and direct its movements till victory should crown the combatants. Such is the interest of the land we are now approaching. Here mighty champions are to contend. Here wise and learned doctors are to teach. But first let us briefly describe the condition in which we find it. The horrible night that has so long covered these lovely valleys and those majestic mountains, on which the first streaks of morning are now beginning to be discernible. Chapter 2. Condition of Switzerland prior to the Reformation. Primitive and medieval Christianity. The latter unlike the former. Change in Church's discipline. In her clergy. In her worship. State of Switzerland. Ignorance of the Bible. The sacred language is unknown. Greek is heresy. Decay of schools. Decay of theology. Distracted state of society. All things covenantally holy. Sale of benefices. Swiss livings held by foreigners. So changed was the Christianity of the Middle Ages from the Christianity of primitive times that it could not have been known to be the same gospel. The crystal fountains, amid the remote and solitary hills, and the foul and turbid river, formed by their waters, after stagnating in marshes, or receiving the pollution of the great cities past which they roll, are not more unlike than were the pure and simple gospel as it issued at the beginning from its divine source, and the gospel exhibited to the world after the traditions and corruptions of men had been incorporated with it. The government of the Church, so easy and sweet in the first age, had grown into a veritable tyranny. The faithful pastors who fed the flock with knowledge and truth, watching with care lest harm should come to the fold, had given place to shepherds who slumbered at their post, or awoke up only to eat the fat and clothe themselves with the wool. The simple and spiritual worship of the first age had, by the 5th century, been changed into a ceremonial, which Augustine complained was less tolerable than the yoke under which the Jews formerly groaned. The Christian churches of that day were but little distinguishable from the pagan temples of a former era, and Yahuwah was adored by the same ceremonies and rites by which the heathen had expressed their reverence for their deities. In truth, the throne of the Eternal was obscured by the cloud of divinities placed around it, and the one great object of worship was forgotten in the distraction caused by the many competitors, angels, saints, and images, for the homage due to him alone. It was to no effect, one would think, to pull down the pagan temple and demolish the altar of the heathen god, seeing that they were to be replaced with fanes as truly superstitious, and images as grossly idolatrous. As early as the 4th century, Saint Martin, Bishop of Tours, found in his diocese an altar which one of his predecessors had set up in honor of a brigand, who was worshipped as a martyr. The stream of corruption, swollen to such dimensions so early as the 5th century, flowed down with an ever-augmenting volume to the 15th. There was not a country in Christendom which the deluge did not overflow. Switzerland was visited with the fertile stream as well as other lands, and it will help us to estimate the mighty blessing which the Reformation conferred on the world, and to take a few examples of the darkness in which this country was plunged before that epoch. The ignorance of the age extended to all classes and to every department of human knowledge. The sciences and the learned languages were alike unknown. Political and theological knowledge were equally neglected. To be able to read a little Greek, says the celebrated Claude d'Espens, speaking of that time, was to render oneself suspected of heresy. To possess a little knowledge of Hebrew was almost to be a heretic outright. The schools destined for the instruction of youth contained nothing that was fitted to humanize, and sent forth barbarians rather than scholars. It was a common saying in those days, the more skillful a grammarian, the worse a theologian. To be a sound divine, it was necessary to eschew letters, and verily the clerks of those days ran little risk of spoiling their theology and lowering their reputation by the continuation of learning. For more than 400 years, the theologians knew the Bible only through the Latin version, commonly styled the Vulgate, being absolutely ignorant of the original tongues. Zwingli, the reformer of Zurich, drew upon himself the suspicions of certain priests as a heretic, because he diligently compared the original Hebrew of the Old Testament with this version, and Rudolf M. Ruhl, otherwise Collinus, professor of Greek at Zurich, tells us he was on one occasion in great danger from having in his possession certain Greek books, a thing that was accounted an indubitable mark of heresy. He was canon of Münster in Arago in the year 1523, when the magistrates of Lucerne sent certain priests to visit his house. Discovering the obnoxious volumes and judging them to be Greek, from the character we presume, for no respectable curé would in those days have any nearer acquaintance with the tongue of Demosthenes. This, they cried, is Lutheranism. This is heresy. Greek and heresy. It is the same thing. A priest of the Grisons, at a public disputation on religion held at Lands about the year 1526, loudly bewailed that ever the learned languages had entered Helvetia. If, he said, Hebrew and Greek had never been heard of in Switzerland, what a happy country, what a peaceful state. But now, alas, here they are, and see what a torrent of errors and heresies has rushed in after them. At that time, there was only one academy in all Switzerland, namely at Basel, nor had it existed longer than 50 years, having been founded by Pope Pius II, Aeneas Sylvius, in the middle of the 15th century. There were numerous colleges of canons, it is true, and convents of men, richly endowed, and meant in part to be nurseries of scholars and theologians, but these establishments had now become nothing better than retreats of Epicurism and nests of ignorance. In particular, the Abbey of St. Gall, formerly a renowned school of learning, to which the sons of princes and great lords were sent to be taught, and which in the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries had sent forth many learned men, had by this time fallen into inefficiency, and indeed to barbarism. John Smith, or Faber, vicar of the Bishop of Constance, and a noted polemic of the day, as well as a great enemy of the Reformation and the Reformers, publicly avowed, in a dispute he had with Zwingli, that he knew just a little Greek, but knew nothing whatever of Hebrew. It need not surprise us that the common priests were so illiterate, when even the popes themselves, the princes of the Church, were hardly more learned. A Roman Catholic author has candidly confessed that there have been many popes so ignorant that they knew nothing at all of grammar. As regards theology, the divines of those days aimed only at becoming adepts in the scholastic philosophy. They knew but one book in the world, to them the sum of all knowledge, the fountainhead of all truth, the sentences of Peter Lombard. While the Bible lay beside them unopened, the pages of Peter Lombard were diligently studied. If they wished to alternate their reading, they turned not to Scripture, but to the writings of Scotus or Thomas Aquinas. These authors were their lifelong study. to sit at the feet of Isaiah or David or John, to seek the knowledge of salvation at the pure sources of truth, was never thought of by them. Their great authority was Aristotle, not St. Paul. In Switzerland, there were doctors of divinity who had never read the Holy Scriptures. There were priests and curies who had never seen a Bible all their days. In the year 1527, the magistrates of Bern wrote to Sebastian de Montfaucon, the last bishop of Lausanne, saying that a conference was to be held in their city on religion, at which all points were to be decided by an appeal to sacred scriptures, and requesting him to come himself, or at least send some of his theologians to maintain their side of the question. Alas, the perplexity of the good bishop! I have no person, wrote he to the lords of Bern, sufficiently versed in Holy Scripture to assist at such a dispute. This recalls a yet more ancient fact of a similar kind. In A.D. 680, the Emperor Constantine Pogonatus summoned a general council, the sixth, to be held in his capital at Barbary. The Pope of the day, Agatho, wrote to Constantine, excusing the non-attendance of the Italian bishops, on the score that he could not find in all Italy a single ecclesiastic sufficiently acquainted with the inspired oracles to send to the council. But if the century had few copies of the Word of Life, it had armies of monks. It had an astoundingly long list of saints, to whose honor every day new shrines were erected. And it had churches to which the splendor of their architecture and the pomp of their ceremonies gave an imposing magnificence, while the bull of Boniface V took care that they should not want frequenters, for in this century was passed the infamous law which made the churches places of refuge for malefactors of every description. The few who studied the Scriptures were contemned as ignoble souls who were content to plod along on the humblest road, and who lacked the ambition to climb to the sublimer heights of knowledge. Bachelor was the highest distinction to which they could attain, whereas the study of the sentences opened to others the path to the coveted honor of Doctor of Divinity. The priest had succeeded in making it be believed that the study of the Bible was necessary neither for the defense of the Church nor for the salvation of her individual members, and that for both ends tradition sufficed. In what peace and concord would men have lived, said the vicar of Constance, if the gospel had never been heard of in the world? The great teacher has said that God must be worshipped in spirit and in truth, not in spirit only, but in truth, even that gospel which God has revealed. Consequently, when that truth was hidden, worship became impossible. Worship after this was simply masquerade. The priest stood up before the people to make certain magical signs with his fingers, or to mutter unintelligible words between his teeth, or to vociferate at the utmost pitch of his voice. Of a like character were the religious acts enjoined on the people. Justice, mercy, humility, and the other virtues of early times were of no value. All holiness lay in prostrating one's self before an image, adoring a relic, purchasing an indulgence, performing a pilgrimage, or paying one's tithes. This was the devotion. These were the graces that lent their glory to the ages in which the Roman faith was in the ascendant. The baron could not ride out till he had donned his coat of mail, lest he should be assailed by his neighbor baron. The peasant tilled the earth, or herded his oxen, with the collar of his master around his neck. The merchant could not pass from fair to fair, but at risk of being plundered. The robber and the murderer waylaid the passenger who traveled without an escort, and the blood of man was continually flowing in private quarrels and on the battlefield. But the times, doubtless, were eminently holy, for all around, wherever one looked, one beheld the symbols of devotion: crosses, pardons, privileged shrines, images, relics, aves, cowls, girdles, and palmer staves, and all the machinery which the religion of the times had invented to make all things holy. Earth, air, and water, everything, in short, save the soul of men. Polydore Virgil, an Italian and a good Catholic, wishing to pay a compliment to the piety of those of whom he was speaking, said they had more confidence in their images than in Jesus Christ himself, whom the image represents. Within the church there was seen only a scramble for temporalities, such as might be seen in a city abandoned to pillage, where each strives to appropriate the largest share of the spoil. The ecclesiastical benefices were put up to auction, in effect, and knocked down to the highest bidder. This was found to be the easiest way of gathering the gold of Christendom and pouring it into the great treasury of Rome, that treasury into which, like another sea, flowed all rivers of the earth, and yet, like the sea, it never was full. Some of the popes tried to reduce the scandal, but the custom was too deeply rooted to yield to even their authority. Martin V, in concert with the Council of Constance, enacted a perpetual constitution, which declared all simoniacs, whether open or secret, excommunicated. His successor Eugenius and the Council of Basel ratified this constitution. It is a fact, nevertheless, that during the pontificate of Pope Martin, the sale of benefices continued to flourish. Finding they could not suppress the practice, the popes evidently thought that their next best course was to profit by it. The rights of the chapters and patrons were abolished, and bands of needy priests were seen crossing the Alps, with papal briefs in their hands, demanding admission into vacant benefices. From all parts of Switzerland came the loud complaints that the churches had been invaded by strangers. Of the numerous body of canons attached to the cathedral church in Geneva in 1527, one only was a native. All the rest were foreigners. Chapter 3. Corruption of the Swiss Church. The government of the Pope. How the shepherd fed his sheep. Text from Aquinas and Aristotle. Preachers and their sermons. Council of Moudon and the Vicar. Canons of Neuchâtel. Passion plays. Excommunication employed against debtors. Invasion of the magistrate's jurisdiction. Lucerne. Beauty of its site. Frightful disorders of its clergy. Geneva and other Swiss towns. A corrupt church, the greatest scourge of the world. Cry for reform. The age turns away from the true reform. A cry that waxens louder, and a corruption that waxes stronger. Over the churches of Switzerland, as over those of the rest of Europe, the Pope had established a tyranny. He built this usurpation on such make-believes as the Holy Chair, the Vicar of Jesus Christ, and the infallibility thence deduced. He regulated all things according to his pleasure. He forbade the people to read the Scriptures. He every day made new ordinances to the destruction of the laws of God, and all priests, bishops, too, he bound to obey him by an oath of peculiar stringency. The devices were infinite: annats, reservations, tithes, double and treble, amulets, dispensations, pardons, rosaries, relics, by which provision was made whereby the humblest sheep in the remotest corner of the vast fold of the Pope might send yearly to Rome a money acknowledgment of the allegiance he owed to that great shepherd, whose seat was on the banks of the Tiber, but whose iron crook reached to the extremities of Christendom. But was that shepherd equally alive to what he owed the flock? Was the instruction which he took care to provide them with wholesome and abundant? Is it to the pastures of the Word that he conducted them? The priests of those days had no Bible. How then could they communicate to others what they had not learned themselves? If they entered a pulpit, it was to rehearse a fable, to narrate a legend, or to repeat a stale jest, and they deemed their oratory amply repaid if their audience gaped at one and laughed at the other. If a text was announced, it was selected not from Scriptures, but from Scotus or Thomas Aquinas, or the moral philosophy of Aristotle. Could grapes grow on such trees, or sweet waters issue from such a fountain? But in truth, few priests were so adventurous as to mount a pulpit or attempt addressing a congregation. The most part were dumb. They left the duty of storytelling or preaching to the monks, and in particular to the mendicants. I must record, says the historian Bouquet, a fact to the honor of the Council of Moudon. Not a little displeased at seeing that the curé of the town was a dumb pastor who left his parishioners without instruction, the council in November 1535 ordered him to explain, at least to the common people, the 10 Commandments of the law of God, every Sabbath, after the celebration of the office of the Mass. Whether the curé's theological acquirements enabled him to fulfill the council's injunction, we do not know. He might have pleaded, as a set-off to his own indolence, a yet more scandalous neglect of duty to be witnessed not far off, at Neuchâtel, so pleasantly situated at the foot of the Jura Alps, with its lake reflecting on its tranquil bosom the image of the vine-clad heights that environ it, was a college of canons. These ecclesiastics lived in grand style, for the foundation was rich, the air pleasant, and the wine good. But, says Bouquet, it looked as if they were paid to keep silence, for though they were many, there was not one of them all that could preach. In those enlightened days, the ballad singers and the playwrights supplemented the deficiencies of the preachers. The Church held it dangerous to put it into the hands of the people, the vernacular gospel, lest they should read in their own tongue of the wondrous birth at Bethlehem, and not less the wondrous death on Calvary, with all that lay between. But the Passion and other biblical events were turned into comedies and dramas, and acted in public, with how much edification to the spectators one may guess. In the year 1531, the Council of Moudon gave 10 florins of Savoy to a company of tragedians who played the Passion on Palm Sunday and the Resurrection on Easter Monday. If Luther had not come, said the German Ave, calling to mind this and similar occurrences, if Luther had not come, the Pope by this time would have persuaded men to feed themselves on dust. The raging greed, like a burning thirst, tormented the clergy. From their head downwards, each several order became the scourge of the one beneath it. The inferior clergy, pillaged by the superior, as the superior by their sovereign priest at Rome, fleeced in their turn those under them. Having bought, said the historian of the Swiss Reformation, the Church in gross, they sold it in detail. Money was the mystic potency that set going and kept working the machine of Romanism. There were churches to be dedicated, cemeteries to be consecrated, bells to be baptized. All this must be paid for. There were infants to be christened, marriages to be blessed, and the dead to be buried. Nothing of all this could be done without money. There were masses to be said for the repose of the soul. There were victims to be rescued from the raging flames of purgatory. It was vain to think of doing this without money. There was, moreover, the privilege of sepulture in the floor of the church, above all near the altar, where the dead man mouldered in ground preeminently holy, and the prayers offered for him were especially efficacious. That was worth a great sum, and a heavy price was charged for it. There were those who wished to eat flesh on Lent, or in forbidden times, and there were those who felt it burdensome to fast at any season. Well, the Church had arranged to meet the wishes of both, only, as was reasonable, such accommodation must be paid for. All needed pardon. Well, here it is, a plenary pardon. the pardon of all one's sins up to the hour of one's death. But first the price had to be paid down. Well, the price has been paid. The soul has taken its departure, fortified with a plenary absolution. But this has to be rendered yet more plenary by the payment of a supplemental sum. Though why, we cannot well say, for now we touch on the borders of a subject which is shrouded in mystery, and which no Romish theologian has attempted to make plain. In short, as said the poet Mantoun, the Church of Rome is an enormous market, stocked with all sorts of wares, and regulated by the same laws which govern all other markets of the world. The man who comes to it with money may have everything, but alas, for him who comes without money, he can have nothing. Everyone knows how simple the discipline of the early church, and how spiritual the ends to which it was directed. The pastors of those days wielded it only to guard the doctrine of the church from the corruption of error, and her communion from the contamination of scandalous persons. For far different ends was the church's discipline employed in the 15th century in Switzerland and other countries of Europe. One abuse of it, very common, was to employ it for compelling payment of debts. The creditor went to the bishop and took out an excommunication against his debtor. To the poor debtor this was much more formidable affair than any civil process. The penalties reached the soul as well as the body, and extended beyond the grave. The magistrate had often to interfere and forbid a practice that was not more an oppression of the citizen than a manifest invasion of his own jurisdiction. We find the Council of Meudon, 7th July 1532, forbidding a certain Antoine Jayet, chaplain and vicar of the church, to execute any interdiction against any layman of the towns and parish of Meudon, and promising to guarantee him against all consequences before his superiors. Nor was it long till the council had to make good their guarantee. For the same month, the vicar having failed to execute one of these interdictions against a burgess of Meudon, the council deputed 2 of their number to defend him before the chapter at Lausanne, which had summoned him before it to answer for his disobedience. A frequent consequence was that corpses remained unburied. If the husband died under excommunication for debt, the wife could not consign the body to the grave, nor the son that of the father. The excommunication must first be revoked. This prostitution of ecclesiastical discipline was a very common occurrence, and inflicted a grievance that was widely felt, not only at the epoch of the Reformation, but all through the 15th century. It was one of the many devices by which the Roman Church worked her way underneath the temporal power, and filched from its rightful jurisdiction, thrones, judgment seats, in short, the whole machinery of civil government that Church left standing. But she contrived to place her own functions in these chairs of rule. She talked loftily of the king's dignity. She styled princes the anointed of heaven. But she deprived their scepters of all real power by the crotchets of her bishop. In the year 1480, we find the inhabitants of the Pays de Vaud complaining to Philibert, Duke of Savoy, their liege lord, that his subjects who had the misfortune to be in debt were made answerable, not in his courts, but to the officer of the Bishop of Lausanne, by whom they were visited with the penalty of excommunication. The Duke did not take the matter so quietly as many others. He fulminated a decree dated Chambéry, August 31st, against this usurpation of his jurisdiction on the part of the bishop. It remains only that we touch on what was the saddest part of the corruption of those melancholy days, the libertinism of the clergy. Its frightful excess made the full and open exposure of the scandal impossible. Oftener than once did Swiss cantons complain that their spiritual guides led worse lives than the laymen, and that while they went about their church performances with an indevotion and coldness that shocked the pious, they gave themselves up to profanity, drunkenness, gluttonous, and uncleanness. We shall let the men who then lived, and who witnessed this corruption and suffered from it, describe it. In the year 1477, sometime after the election of Benedict of Montferrand to the bishopric of Lausanne, the Bernese came to him on the 2nd of August to complain of their clergy, whose irregularities they were no longer able to bear. "We see clearly," said they, "that the clergy of our land are extremely debauched and given up to impurity, and that they practice their wickedness openly, without any feeling of shame. They keep their concubines, they resort at night to houses of debauchery, and they do all this with so much boldness, that it is plain they have neither honor nor conscience, and are not restrained by the fear either of God or man. This afflicts us extremely. Our ancestors have often made police regulations to arrest these disorders, particularly when they saw that the ecclesiastical tribunals gave themselves no care about the matter." A similar complaint was lodged in the year 1500 against the monks of Priory of Granson by the lords of Bern and Freiburg. But to what avail? Despite these complaints and police regulations, the manners of the clergy remained unreformed. The salt had lost its savor, and wherewith could it be salted? The law of corruption is to become yet more corrupt. So would it assuredly have been in Switzerland. From its corruption, corruption only would have come in endless and ever grosser developments, had not Protestantism come to sow with beneficent hand and quicken with heavenly breath in the bosom of society the seeds from which it was to spring a new life. Men needed not laws to amend the old, but a power to create the new. The examples we have given, and it is the violence of the malady that illustrates the power of the physician, are sufficiently deplorable. But sad as they are, they fade from view and pass from memory in presence of this one enormity, which an ancient document has handed down to us, and which we must glance at, for we shall only glance, not dwell, on the revolting spectacle. It will give us some idea of the frightful moral gulf in which Switzerland was sunk, and how inevitable would have been its ruin had not the arm of the Reformation plucked it from the abyss. On the northern shore of Lake Leman stands the city of Lausanne. Its site is one of the grandest in Switzerland. Crowned with its cathedral towers, the city looks down on the noble lake, and sweeps along in mighty crescent of blue, from where Geneva on its mount of rock is dimly descried in the west, till it bathes the feet of the two mighty Alps, the Dent du Midi and the Dent de Mauricle, which like twin pillars guard the entrance to the Rhone Valley. Near it on this side, the country is one continuous vineyard, from amid which hamlets and towns sweetly look out. Yonder, just dipping into the lake, is the Dijon of Chillon, recalling the story of Bonnivard, to whose captivity within its walls the genius of Brian has given a wider than a merely Swiss fame. And beyond, on the other side of the lake, is Savoy, a rolling country, clothed with noble forests and rich pastures, and walled in on the far distance, on the southern horizon, by the white peaks of the Alps. But what a blot in this fair scene was Lausanne. We speak of the Lausanne of the 16th century. In the year 1533, the Lausannese preferred a list of 23 charges against their canons and priests, and another of 7 articles against their bishop, Sebastian de Montfaucon. Rouquat has given the document in full, article by article, but parts of it will not bear translation in these pages, so giving those it concerns the benefit of this difficulty, we take the liberty of presenting it in an abridged form. The canons and priests, according to the statement of their parishioners, sometimes quarreled when saying their offices, and fought in the church. The citizens who came to join the cathedral service were, on occasion, treated by the canons in a fight, and stabbed with poignards. Certain ecclesiastics had slain 2 of the citizens in one day, but no reckoning had been held with them for the deed. The canons especially were notorious for their profligacy. Masked and disguised as soldiers, they sallied out into the streets at night, brandishing naked swords, to the terror and at times the effusion of blood of those they encountered. They sometimes attacked the citizen in their own houses, and when threatened with ecclesiastical inflections, denied the bishop's power and his right to pronounce excommunication upon them. Certain of them had been visited with excommunication, but they went on saying Mass as before. In short, the clergy were just as bad as they could possibly be, and there was no crime of which many of them had not at one time or another been guilty. The citizens further complain that when the plague visited Lucerne, many had been suffered to die without confession and the sacrament. Priests could hardly plead in excuse and excess of work, seeing they found time to gamble in the taverns, where they seasoned their talk with oaths and cursed some unlucky throw of the dice. They revealed confessions, were adroit at the framing of testaments, and made false entries in their own favor. They were the governors of the hospital, and their management had resulted in a great impoverishment of its revenues. Unhappily, Lucerne was not an exceptional case. It exhibits the picture of what Geneva and Neuchâtel and other towns of the Swiss Confederacy in those days were, although we are glad to be able to say, not in so aggravated a degree. Geneva, to which, when touched by the Reform light, there was to open a future so different, lay plunged at this moment in disorders under its bishop, Pierre de la Baume, and stood next to Lucerne in the notoriety it had achieved by the degeneracy of its manners. But it is needless to particularize. All round that noble lake which, with its smiling banks and its magnificent mountain boundaries, here the Jura, there the White Alps, form so grand a feature of Switzerland, were villages and towns from which went up a cry not unlike that which ascended from the cities of the plain in early days. This is but a partial lifting of the veil, even conceding that these are extreme cases. Still, what a terrible conclusion do they force upon us as regards the moral state of Christendom. And when we think that these polluting streams flowed from the sanctuary, and the instrumentality ordained by God for the purification of society had become the main means of corrupting it, we are taught that, in some respects, the world has more to fear from the admixture of Christianity with error than the Church has. It was the world that first brought this corruption into the Church, but see what a terrible retaliation the Church now takes upon the world. One does not wonder that there is heard on every side at this era an infinite number of voices, lay and cleric, calling for the reformation of the Church. Yet the majority of those from whom these demands came were but groping in the dark. But God never leaves himself without a witness. A century before this, he had put before the world, in the ministry of Wycliffe, plain, clear, and demonstrated the one and only plan of a true Reformation. Putting his finger upon the page of the New Testament, Wycliffe said, "Here it is. Here is what you seek. You must forget the past 1,000 years. You must look at what is written on this page. You will find in the book the pattern of the Reformation of the Church, and not the pattern only, but the power by which that Reformation can alone be realized." Well, we have just run out of time. I thank you all for joining me. Be sure to come back next time. Hi, I'm Nicholas Arthur, and I'd like to introduce you to my latest book, Reformed Prophecy Interpretation, an apology for Reformed premillennial historicism in the 21st century. As with primitive biblical Christianity, historicism is the method of prophecy interpretation restored with the advent of the Protestant Reformation, and had become so widely held that for a long time it was called the Protestant view. My book is not so much about the errors of dispensationalism or amillennialism. Rather, it is about the historicist alternative to understanding many of the same passages from the vantage point of prophecy fulfilled in history. For those that desire more than mere hypotheses, bolstered with conjectured speculation, those who require explicit biblical exegesis and verified historical fulfillment, and are not willing to accept speculation as anything other than what it is, speculation, not truth. This book is for you. Over the last century, this method of interpretation has become almost completely forgotten, even by Protestants, in the face of a method that is based almost entirely on future speculation, rather than fulfilled prophecy in history. In my book, I examine the reasons for this and investigate some of the prophecy which has been fulfilled in the interim, as well as present an apology for Reformed premillennial historicism to the 21st century. If you're interested in a copy of my book, you can go to my website, crosstheborder.org, and get more information there, or you may also find it at Amazon.